August 19th, 1944. Wehrmacht Headquarters, East Prussia. General Oberst Alfred Jodl studied the latest intelligence reports from the collapsing Western Front. The numbers looked clean, rational, and reassuring. The Americans had advanced over 400 miles from the Normandy beaches. Their armored spearheads, under General Patton, were racing toward the Seine. But every German officer at Wolfschan's headquarters knew the immutable law of warfare. No army can outrun its fuel. An armored division, Jodl noted, consumed 150,000 gallons of gasoline per day when advancing. Patton's Third Army had 12 such divisions, each separated from their supply depots by over 400 miles of ruined roads and destroyed bridges. By every calculation, they should have stopped already. "They have advanced faster than logistics allows," Jodl told his staff. "The Americans will be halted within days, perhaps hours." That conclusion made perfect sense to men who had built the concept of blitzkrieg. They knew the tyranny of supply lines. Their own campaigns in Russia had frozen not because of Soviet resistance, but because fuel, ammunition, and spare parts never reached the front. 80% of German transport still relied on horse-drawn wagons, and the primitive Russian roads had devoured their trucks by the thousands. Even the Reich's most modern army had collapsed under its own momentum. Surely, the Americans, so mechanically dependent, so careless with consumption, would meet the same fate. But that afternoon, barely 125 miles away, the sound of engines told a different story. From Cherbourg through Avranches and Le Mans, 5,958 trucks were already rolling eastward in a continuous one-way convoy. Headlights blazed in defiance of every military doctrine, carrying over 12,500 tons of supplies every 24 hours. The operation was called the Red Ball Express, a phrase borrowed from American railroad slang where Red Ball freight meant a high-priority, non-stop shipment. It would become the most audacious logistical enterprise of World War II, and the moment when the Wehrmacht learned that industrial logic could be deadlier than tactical brilliance. The first warning signs came from German reconnaissance units near Chartres. Observers reported continuous streams of vehicles, lights visible for 20 kilometers, moving without blackout discipline. To seasoned German staff officers, it seemed suicidal. Convoys with lights invited air attack. Lack of spacing meant one hit could block an entire highway. Yet the Americans ignored every rule. Behind that apparent recklessness lay a new philosophy of war. At a requisitioned chateau near Le Mans, Lieutenant Colonel Lorne Ayres of the Motor Transport Service faced a skeptical room of officers on August 25th. The mathematics they presented to him were damning. Patton's army was burning through supplies faster than any force in history. Traditional methods, rail depots, scheduled convoys, depot-to-depot transfer, had collapsed under the strain. Ayres stood up, slammed his fist on the table, and said, "Gentlemen, we're going to build a one-way highway from Cherbourg to the front. Every vehicle will run 20 hours a day, no stops except fuel or breakdowns. We'll move 12,500 tons daily, minimum." No one in the room believed it possible. Even the most optimistic planners considered 3,000 tons a day an upper limit. But Ayres wasn't designing a normal operation. He was about to invent the industrial highway of war. Within 36 hours, orders went out. 2 parallel one-way routes. Convoys at 5-minute intervals. Average speed 35 miles per hour. No halts, no lights out. Mobile maintenance every 50 miles. Military police units would clear any vehicle below 25 miles per hour. Gasoline stations were set up every 30 miles. The schedule was continuous. No shifts, no rest. Drivers would eat on the road, relieve themselves in empty ration tins, and sleep when they could, which often meant never. On the morning of August 26, 1944, the first trucks of the 39 16th Quartermaster Truck Company, GMC KW 2.5-ton deuce and a halfs, began their eastward crawl, loaded with 105mm shells bound for Patton's artillery near Malin. Painted on their bumpers were crude slogans in white chalk. Patton's Blood Bank, Hitler, Here We Come, Detroit to Berlin Express. What made the Red Ball extraordinary wasn't just its scale, but its people. Of the 23,000 drivers who would operate the route, roughly 75% were African American soldiers serving in a still segregated army. Many had been denied combat roles, confined to labor units. Yet now they were the engine that kept one of the most celebrated generals in history moving forward. For these men, the road was both battlefield and battlefield metaphor. They worked in mud, dust, and constant danger. Trucks overturned on bomb-scarred roads, engines caught fire under strain. Luftwaffe fighter bombers prowled the skies. Some drivers were killed when convoys were strafed. Others simply vanished in accidents along unlit stretches. But they kept driving, often with no sleep for 48 hours. A corporal later recalled, "We had one rule: keep it rolling. If your truck breaks down, push it off the road and grab another. The front can't wait." Meanwhile, in East Prussia, the German General Staff continued their calculations. General Major Siegfried Westphal, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, wrote on August 20th, "Even if the Americans possess unlimited trucks, which they do not, perfect roads, which they do not, and no mechanical failures, which is impossible, they still cannot sustain this rate of advance for more than 48 hours. The physical laws of supply cannot be violated, not even by American industry." But as Westphal inked those words, the physical laws were being rewritten. The Americans were creating not a supply chain, but a supply river. The trucks became cells of a living organism, flowing one way with goods, back empty, refilled, and launched again. The Red Ball Express moved 24 hours a day, headlights glowing like veins of light across France. To German intelligence officers, it seemed madness. To Patton, it was genius. He would later write in his diary, "My tanks don't need courage, they need gas. The Red Ball Express is my bloodline. As long as it runs, I'll keep killing Germans." Within 72 hours, Patton's immobilized divisions smashed through German lines at the Seine. Within a week, they liberated Paris. Within a month, they stood at the German border. The Wehrmacht's most brilliant minds, men who had once taught the world the meaning of modern warfare, were about to receive the harshest lesson of all: that the engine, not the gun, wins wars. And that lesson began with a single impossible equation, solved not by theory, but by 23,000 truck drivers rolling east 20 hours a day on a road the enemy could neither understand nor stop.
Dawn, August 27, 1944. Across northern France, the rumble of thousands of engines rose like an unending storm. From Cherbourg to Le Mans, from Chartres to Paris, the Red Ball Express had come alive. Every 5 minutes, a new convoy rolled east, 60 or 70 trucks per column, each spaced precisely 5 minutes apart. It was not an army anymore. It was a living machine, a 24-hour heartbeat of steel and gasoline. On paper, it was insanity. Every military textbook said the same. Convoys must maintain spacing, obey blackout discipline, stop for rest, and avoid overloading roads. Red Ball Express did the opposite. No stops, no spacing, no blackout, no excuses. Any truck that slowed below 25 miles per hour was yanked off the highway by military police within minutes. Every 50 miles stood an MP checkpoint, half traffic cop, half judge, waving convoys through the darkness, their red lamps slicing the smoky night. These MPs enforced the one commandment of the Red Ball: keep it rolling. Most of the drivers were African-American soldiers, members of the segregated quartermaster truck companies. About 75% of the Red Ball's manpower came from these units. Men denied combat, denied equal pay, denied respect, but now entrusted with the one task that kept Patton's spearheads alive. They worked under impossible pressure. Each man drove his 2.5-ton GMC CCKW, the Deuce and a Half, through dust, mud, or rain, carrying 5 tons of shells, rations, or gasoline. Cabins were cramped, steering columns rattled, and engines howled for hours on end. There was no sleep, no comfort. Some drivers jammed a brick on the accelerator just to rest their legs. Yet out of this exhaustion, a fierce pride emerged. They began painting nicknames on their trucks in white chalk. Patton's Blood Bank, Hitler's Nightmare, Detroit to Berlin Express. Within days, a distinct culture had formed. A brotherhood defined not by race or rank, but by the endless road. A sergeant from the 3916th Truck Company later said, "If you stopped, you were the enemy. If you broke down, you pushed it off. If you fell asleep, someone slapped you awake. There was no pity. We knew that a tank without fuel was just a steel coffin." By August 28th, German reconnaissance units began to notice the glowing arteries of light stretching across France. From hilltops near Rovien, they reported convoys visible for miles, thousands of headlights blazing through the night. One report from Aufklärungsabteilung 116 read, "Continuous column, headlights visible for 20 kilometers. Estimate 1,000 vehicles per hour. Americans have abandoned all camouflage discipline." To the Wehrmacht, it looked like collective suicide. To the Americans, it was efficiency. The Red Ball's twin highways, one for loaded trucks, one for empties returning, operated as a one-way circulatory system. The routes were so busy that local French civilians joked the road had no beginning and no end. Each truck averaged 35 miles per hour, making 1.5 round trips daily. A total of 6,958 vehicles ran simultaneously, burning 300,000 gallons of gasoline every 24 hours, just to feed themselves. German intelligence officers reading captured American fuel reports dismissed the figures as propaganda. They couldn't grasp that the Americans planned for inefficiency. They accepted 20 to 30% mechanical failure as the cost of momentum. Every 50 miles, mobile maintenance teams waited. Mechanics worked like battlefield medics. Diagnose in 15 minutes, repair in 45, or cannibalize parts and push the wreck into the ditch. No paperwork, no inspection, no bureaucracy. German observers would later call it organized waste. The Americans called it standard operating procedure. In the villages of liberated France, the spectacle was unforgettable. Children lined the roads waving as endless convoys roared past. "Les camions américains," they shouted. The drivers threw candy, cigarettes, and soap, luxuries unseen under German occupation. The Red Ball became a moving symbol of liberation. To the French, it was the sound of freedom. To the retreating Germans, it was the sound of despair. In a requisition depot near Rovien, Colonel Charles O. Thrasher, commander of the advanced section of the communication zone, received the week's figures. Vehicle readiness, 92%. Average turnaround, 16 hours. Total tonnage delivered, 89,939 tons in 6 days. Thrasher smiled. The impossible had become routine. The Wehrmacht, meanwhile, clung to doctrine. They prized meticulous planning, regulated maintenance, centralized control. The Americans thrived on the opposite: improvisation, decentralization, and velocity. Every lieutenant acted like a general, every sergeant like an engineer, every driver like his own commander. What the Germans saw as chaos, the Americans called freedom of operation. By the end of August, the Red Ball Express had achieved something unprecedented. A new convoy every 5 minutes. Each trip, 350 miles one way, completed in 14 hours. 2 hours to refuel and reload, 12,500 tons delivered per day. No breaks, no silence. The road never slept. German soldiers at the front rode home describing the constant rumble that haunted their nights. "We hear the Americans even when they are not near. Engines, wheels, brakes, endless. They do not stop. They are not afraid. They are not hiding. They are winning by numbers." For the first time in the war, German intelligence officers began to whisper a terrifying conclusion. The Americans had weaponized abundance. And so, as the Red Ball thundered eastward under a sky streaked with the glow of its headlights, the world witnessed a transformation. Warfare was no longer decided by maneuvers and strategy, but by logistics, horsepower, and the unyielding rhythm of engines. The Germans had built an army of precision. The Americans had built an army of production. At the center of it all sat 23,000 exhausted drivers, men who didn't know they were making history, only that if they stopped, Patton's tanks would too. By August 31st, 1944, those tanks crossed the scene. The Wehrmacht still believed the Americans would soon run out of fuel, but the truth had already passed them by, at 35 miles an hour with headlights blazing. The Red Ball Express was no longer a supply line. It was the pulse of a civilization in motion. By the first week of September 1944, the Allied advance had reached the very edge of its own shadow. Patton's tanks were pushing toward the Moselle River, already deep inside eastern France. But behind them, the Red Ball Express, the lifeline that fed the advance, was starting to crack under the weight of its own success. Each round trip now stretched over 700 miles. Roads were shredded by constant use, bridges sagged under the endless traffic, and mechanics could no longer keep up with the breakdowns. Engines screamed for mercy, tires wore down to the cords, and drivers, many awake for 72 straight hours, were operating in a blur of exhaustion and stimulant haze. The convoy lights that once looked like victory now resembled a fever dream. Patton's advance had outpaced even the Red Ball's miracles. Every calculation said the same thing. The system had reached its limit. The Wehrmacht saw the same signs. On September 8, 1944, General Hasso von Manteuffel wrote from his headquarters, "The American supply lines are collapsing. Convoy intervals have increased. Vehicle speeds are falling. This is our opportunity." He believed he was watching the same logistical paralysis that had doomed his own armies in Russia. But what he couldn't see was that the Americans were already rewriting the rulebook. Again. At the main Red Ball Control Center in Le Mans, Lieutenant Colonel Loren Ayres convened his officers. The reports were grim. 1,800 trucks sidelined daily for mechanical failure, 30% of vehicles out of service, and 300 drivers dead from exhaustion or accidents. And yet, the tonnage still had to move. The decision they made over the next 72 hours turned the Red Ball from a brilliant improvisation into a logistical masterpiece. First, they split the route in two. The long 700-mile run was divided into a rear section from Cherbourg to Chartres, and a forward section from Chartres to the front. Cargo was transferred at new relay depots, cutting each driver's route to 350 miles. Second, they instituted driver rotation. A truck never stopped moving. When one driver reached his limit, another took the wheel. Third, mobile workshops were pushed closer to the front. Mechanics began replacing engines and transmissions in roadside pits. One repair team could swap a CCKW engine in 45 minutes. Finally, the U.S. Army committed another 2,000 trucks, raising the total to nearly 7,000 vehicles. What should have been a collapse became a resurgence. Within 4 days, Red Ball deliveries jumped from 12,000 tons per day to 13,500 tons, a record that stunned even Eisenhower's staff. As the Americans adjusted, the Red Ball network expanded like a living organism. When the main route clogged, they simply built new ones. In early September, engineers marked out parallel expressways. White Ball Express, Rouen to Paris, Green Diamond Route, Cherbourg to Railheads, Red Lion Route, Bayeux to Brussels, ABC Corridor, Antwerp, Brussels, Charleroi. Each opened within 48 hours of conception. No committees, no blueprints, just paint, signs, and orders. Keep rolling east. To German observers, it was incomprehensible. They were trained to plan every bridge, every ton, every fuel drum weeks in advance. The Americans just built as they went. Quote, "It is not war. It is a factory on wheels," unquote, one German colonel wrote. Then came the next American innovation, the Sky Road. When ground transport strained, the Allies created the first large-scale aerial resupply system in history. On September 16, 1944, German radar detected over 900 C-47 Skytrain transports flying toward eastern France. Each carried 3 tons of ammunition, fuel, or medical supplies. In a single day, they delivered 2,700 tons by air, 9 times what the Luftwaffe had managed during the Stalingrad airlift at its peak. One captured German logistics officer wrote bitterly, "They use airplanes as trucks. They do not know the meaning of limitation," unquote. This, more than any battle, convinced German command that the Americans were fighting a new kind of war. But the most staggering proof of the Red Ball's power came from what it built as it moved. In just 1 month, U.S. engineers constructed or reinforced 40 bridges, established 15 major fuel depots, opened 26 maintenance stations, built 8 temporary cities for drivers. All of this happened while the operation continued uninterrupted. When the Wehrmacht blew up the bridge at Mons, German intelligence estimated 6 weeks for replacement. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built a functional crossing in 14 hours. If a road collapsed, bulldozers carved a detour through nearby fields. If bridges were destroyed, engineers laid Bailey spans overnight. The Germans called it chaos. The Americans called it progress. To the people of France, the Red Ball was not chaos. It was liberation in motion. Farmers stopped their work to watch convoys thunder past. Children waved American flags fashioned from scraps of cloth. Drivers tossed them chocolate bars and gum. But for the Germans, the sound became terror itself. Troops began calling it the Geister Convoy, the Ghost Convoy. They claimed to hear the rumble of engines, even when none were near. Psychological warfare officers later noted entire German platoons reporting phantom truck columns moving at night. The Red Ball Express had become more than a logistical system. It was an auditory weapon, a relentless reminder of American abundance. Inside the trucks, reality was brutal. The rules of survival were self-taught. Never stop in rain. If you sleep, leave your headlights on so others see you. When exhausted, open the window and stick your head into the cold wind. If your truck catches fire, keep driving until you're clear of the road, then jump. They were not following orders. They were following instinct. Yet somehow, the chaos worked. By mid-September, while the Wehrmacht was trying to rebuild its shattered fronts, Patton's divisions were advancing 60 miles daily, double what German doctrine considered possible. To the astonishment of Field Marshal Walter Model, the Americans did not slow down. No army can advance 60 miles daily for a week. It defies mechanical law. But intercepted Allied radio confirmed it. Patton's spearheads were still moving. On September 12th, a new Red Ball record was set, 14,000 tons delivered in a single day. For the Wehrmacht, the numbers were a nightmare. They had built their empire on precision and control. The Americans had won with improvisation and excess. In late September, a German intelligence officer summarized what his superiors refused to say aloud. Quote, "They have turned supply into strategy. They have replaced military art with industrial arithmetic. We are not fighting soldiers. We are fighting factories," unquote. And on the muddy highways of France, with 23,000 drivers still pushing eastward through exhaustion and rain, the factories were winning. By the time the autumn storms came, the Red Ball Express had transformed from a desperate improvisation into the greatest logistical operation ever seen. It was no longer just supplying an army. It was defining a new kind of war.
By early October 1944, northern France was drowning in rain. The dusty roads that had carried the Red Ball Express for 2 triumphant months turned into rivers of mud. Convoys crawled forward at half their usual speed. Trucks sank to their axles. Windshields fogged with breath and diesel fumes. Yet still they rolled. Through exhaustion, through the storm, through what every rule of military science said was impossible. The miracle of August had become a nightmare of endurance. The once unstoppable flow of steel now creaked and groaned under its own momentum. 30% of the Red Ball's vehicles were out of action daily. Mechanics worked knee-deep in mud, pulling engines in the rain. Tires shredded by gravel and potholes were replaced by the tens of thousands. Even the drivers, those indestructible men who had driven through exhaustion and gunfire, were reaching the edge of collapse. Every mile felt like a year, recalled Sergeant James R. Thompson of the 388th Truck Company. We weren't fighting the Germans anymore. We were fighting the road. German intelligence noticed the slowdown immediately. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights, rare now due to fuel shortages, reported wider gaps between convoys and a decrease in average speed from 35 miles to 20 miles per hour. To the Wehrmacht's high command, it looked like a familiar pattern: the overextended advance, the fraying supply line, the inevitable stall. On September 8, 1944, General Hasso von Manteuffel wrote with confidence, "The Americans have advanced too far. Their logistics are breaking. Within days, they will stop of their own accord." But the Americans refused to stop. At the main Red Ball control center in Chartres, Lieutenant Colonel Loren Ayres gathered his officers once again. They had already bent the laws of logistics. Now they would have to break them entirely. The solution, improvised in 3 sleepless days, was insane and brilliant. First, the Red Ball was split into 2 separate systems. The long, 700-mile runs that exhausted men and machines were cut in half. Cherbourg to Chartres became the rear sector, Chartres to the front, the forward sector. Each driver now ran shorter loops, with cargo transferred at relay depots built almost overnight. Second, the Army created driver relay stations. Trucks would never stop moving. When one driver reached his limit, another would take over. It was the first 24-hour relay supply chain in modern warfare. Third, the Americans pushed maintenance forward. Mobile workshops operated almost at the front lines. One team could replace an engine in under an hour, under rain, under fire. Even the drivers, those indestructible men who had driven through exhaustion and gunfire, were reaching the edge of collapse. At the end of the Red Ball's Minkt vloog elevens eth ier ekte free fro ispadan of Kai 12. Never stop unless you're on fire, and if you are, drive at least a mile before jumping. If you see a broken down truck, push it into a ditch. If you fall asleep, the guy behind you honks until you wake or crash, whichever comes first. These weren't Army regulations, they were survival instincts. Yet, somehow, the convoys kept moving. By early September, despite all odds, Patton's spearheads were advancing 60 miles a day. German doctrine said 30 was the maximum under ideal conditions. To Field Marshal Walter Model, the reports sounded like fantasy. No army can advance 60 miles a day for a week. It violates mechanical law. But the evidence was undeniable. American radio traffic confirmed it. The Red Ball Express had turned logistics into a weapon that could not be outflanked, bombed, or mathematically explained. The Germans tried to strike back. Luftwaffe fighter bombers targeted highways, but the convoy simply detoured. Bridges were destroyed, only to be replaced within hours by Bailey bridges, modular steel spans the Americans could assemble in less time than it took the Germans to prepare demolition charges. When one major bridge near Monty was destroyed, engineers rebuilt it in 14 hours. The Wehrmacht's own engineers had estimated 6 weeks. Colonel Ernst Heuschunger, later chief of the German General Staff, admitted in his memoirs, "They built faster than we could destroy. They replaced faster than we could kill. We fought armies, they fought time, and they won." By early October, the Red Ball Express had become a self-perpetuating legend. German soldiers in the field began to talk about ghost convoys, endless lines of American trucks that could be heard but never seen. Psychologists in the Wehrmacht coined a new term, Verstoßungszone. Men feared not the American tanks, but the endless fuel and ammunition that kept them coming. What had begun as an emergency improvisation had become psychological warfare on wheels. Patton, now standing at the German border, wrote to his staff, Our supply system is the most powerful weapon in the Army. Tell the drivers of the Red Ball Express they are winning this war as surely as my tanks." He wasn't exaggerating. Because by the time autumn turned the fields of Lorraine to mud, the Germans had realized the truth too late. They weren't just losing to soldiers. They were losing to a system that refused to stop.
By November 1944, the roar of the Red Ball Express began to fade. Rain turned to sleet. Convoy routes that once glowed with the fire of endless headlights were now streaked with snow and ice. The last trucks rattled eastward toward the German border, their engines coughing through frozen air, tires wrapped in chains, radiators filled with alcohol to keep from freezing. The operation that had begun as a desperate improvisation in August was finally coming to an end, but not because it had failed. It was ending because it had succeeded too well. Rail lines, now repaired and reconnected, began to take over the burden of supply. The Red Ball Express had done its job. It had kept the Allied advance alive long enough for the permanent infrastructure to catch up. For 82 consecutive days, its drivers had carried nearly 412,000 tons of supplies, over 122 million ton-miles across war-torn France. But beyond the statistics lay something deeper, something no German general, no war planner, and perhaps not even the Americans themselves had anticipated. The Red Ball Express had changed the very meaning of warfare. German field commanders could not comprehend it. In captured reports, they tried to explain their defeat in rational terms: superior enemy numbers, air superiority, fuel shortages. But privately, many admitted something different. General der Infanterie Friedrich Schultz wrote in his final report from the collapsing Western Front, "The Americans have achieved warfare beyond our imagination. They do not build permanent systems, they create temporary civilizations. Thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, millions of tons of material, appearing, functioning, dissolving. They built faster than we could destroy." Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, once the most respected strategist in the Wehrmacht, read the Red Ball intelligence summaries in disbelief. He gathered his staff and said quietly, "Gentlemen, we have been defeated not by their generals, but by their industry. The Americans have created a supply system that makes distance irrelevant. Our strategy assumed they would outrun their logistics. That point does not exist." It was, in effect, the death sentence of the German war effort. Even German soldiers on the ground felt it. One captured panzer officer told his interrogators, "We could hear your trucks at night, thousands of them, endless. The sound was worse than your artillery. We knew what it meant. Every engine that turned over meant more fuel, more ammunition, more men. We had nothing left to fight that." Another German prisoner, forced to load captured supplies, summed up the same revelation. "We were fighting a nation of factories. Every bullet we fired, they replaced with 10. Every tank we destroyed, they replaced with 2. You could destroy their soldiers, but not their trucks." To them, the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck, the Deuce and a Half, was the true weapon of the Allied advance. By war end, over 500,000 of them had been built, more than all the trucks in the entire German military combined. Inside the American command structure, the realization was dawning as well. Logistics was no longer the rear area. It was the war itself. Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee, the man responsible for the Red Ball's creation, later wrote, "We wore out 5,000 trucks and 23,000 men to destroy the German army in France. In any previous war, that would be catastrophic. In this one, it was acceptable overhead." He wasn't exaggerating. The Red Ball Express consumed 57 million gallons of fuel, 180,000 tires, and $100 million in 1944 dollars. Yet it shortened the war by an estimated 6 months. Considering that each day of World War II cost the United States $250 million, the Red Ball paid for itself many times over.
Patton himself, never one for understatement, wrote in his memoirs, "The truck drivers of the Red Ball Express deserve as much credit for the defeat of Germany as any combat unit. They drove through exhaustion, through weather that stopped tanks, through roads that barely existed. Without them, the Third Army would have stopped. Without the Third Army, we would not have won." But the story was not just one of logistics or engineering. It was also a story of justice long delayed. Of the 23,000 Red Ball drivers, 3 out of 4 were African American soldiers, serving in a segregated army that denied them equality even as it relied on them utterly. They ate in separate mess halls, slept in separate quarters, and could not be promoted beyond certain ranks. Yet they had delivered the supplies that made Allied victory possible. When General Eisenhower visited a Red Ball convoy in September 1944, he saw it firsthand. His aide, Harry Butcher, recorded the moment. The general stood watching the colored drivers who'd been at it for 20 hours straight. He said, "These men are winning the war as surely as any infantry. We need to reconsider many things." He was right. The Red Ball Express became a turning point, not only in military history, but in American social history. 3 years later, in 1948, President Truman issued Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces. Many historians trace that decision directly back to the Red Ball. Because in France, those men had already proved what America was still learning. Given opportunity and respect, they could do the impossible. When the Red Ball Express officially ended on November 16, 1944, it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. In just 72 hours, the temporary highways were closed, depots dismantled, and trucks reassigned to other routes. The operation left behind no permanent structures, only ruts in the roads, bridges hastily repaired, and stories told by exhausted men who had changed the course of the war. But its legacy lived on. The men who drove those convoys returned home and built something new. Many of them used their experience to found America's modern trucking industry. Companies like Yellow Freight, Roadway, and Consolidated Freightways were started by Red Ball veterans who had learned that volume beats perfection, that speed beats elegance, and that if you keep trucks rolling 24 hours a day, you can move the world. German generals, looking back after the war, spoke of the Red Ball Express with a kind of haunted admiration. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring was asked in 1946 what most surprised him about the Americans. He didn't hesitate. "Not your tanks, not your planes, your trucks." Another general put it more bluntly. "We prepared for everything, your armor, your Air Force, your Navy. We never prepared for your trucks." He wasn't alone in that admission. The Red Ball Express had proven that in modern war, it was not the best tactics or bravest soldiers that decided victory. It was the side that could deliver the most, the fastest, the furthest. At the 50th anniversary commemoration in 1994, a surviving Red Ball driver named William Crawford stood before a crowd of veterans and historians at the National Postal Museum in Washington, D.C., where a stamp honoring the Red Ball Express was unveiled. When asked how it felt to be part of history, he smiled and simply said, "We were just trying to keep the gas moving. Nobody told us we were changing the world." And perhaps that was the true secret. While the German generals debated theory and strategy, while Hitler demanded maps and miracles, 23,000 American truck drivers, most of them black, most of them unnamed, kept an army alive at 35 miles per hour. They didn't know they were making history, but they did. Because in 1944, the road to victory wasn't paved with glory. It was paved with gasoline, courage, and endless roaring wheels. And as one German officer said, standing by a captured highway near Metz, watching the endless convoys thunder eastward, "You can fight men, you can fight tanks, you can fight planes. But how do you fight an enemy who has more trucks than you have soldiers?" The answer came at 5-minute intervals, 6,000 engines strong, rolling relentlessly, toward victory.